Two American Civil War military engagements were fought at the Cabin Creek battlefield in the Cherokee Nation within Indian Territory. The location was where the Texas Road crossed Cabin Creek, near the present-day town of Big Cabin, Oklahoma. Both the first and second battles of Cabin Creek were launched by the Confederate Army to disrupt Union Army supply trains. The first was a raid by a Confederate Army detachment on a Union Army supply train bound for Fort Gibson in July 1863. It failed to stop the Union detachment, which enabled the Union to succeed in winning the Battle of Honey Springs later that month. The second engagement, in September 1864, again a Confederate raid on a Union supply train, resulted in the Confederates capturing over $1 million worth of mules, wagons and supplies. However, this was too late to have a strategic impact on the outcome of the war. Confederate General Stand Waisher led the attackers during both raids. First Battle of Cabin Creek. The First Battle of Cabin Creek took place on July 1 through July 2, 1863, in Mayes County, Oklahoma during the American Civil War. The Confederate forces under Colonel Stand Waisher attempted to ambush a Union supply convoy led by Colonel James M. Williams. Williams was alerted to the attack and, despite the waters of the creek being swelled by rain, made a successful attack upon the entrenched Confederate position and forced him to flee. The battle was the first in which African American troops fought side by side with their white comrades. Background: Colonel James M. Williams had charge of the escort of a Union supply train from Fort Scott, Kansas to Fort Gibson, Oklahoma. His force marched along the Texas Road and consisted of detachments of the 2nd Colorado Infantry Regiment, 3rd Wisconsin Volunteer Cavalry Regiment, 6th Regiment Kansas Volunteer Cavalry, 9th Regiment Kansas Volunteer Cavalry, 3rd Regiment Indian Home Guard, 1st Kansas Colored Infantry and the 2nd Kansas Artillery. Confederate Colonel Stand Waisher had intended to ambush Williams' convoy and had 1,600 to 1,800 men lying in wait at the Cabin Creek crossing. Waisher had counted on 1,500 additional men, led by Brigadier General William L. Cabell, to strengthen his force prior to the attack, but Cabell's troops were delayed by high waters on the Grand River. Williams arrived at the crossing on the 1st of July and learned of the intentions of Waitie's force from captured Confederate soldiers. Waitie's battle line extended around 1 mile either side of the crossing in trenches dug into the brush lining the creek. Owing to the unusually high water level in the creek, which reached above shoulder height, Williams chose to delay his attack on the Confederates until the following day and corralled his wagons defensively on a nearby prairie. Williams ordered a half-hour artillery bombardment before launching an assault with the 3rd Indian Home Guard. They failed to make it across the now waist-deep creek, pushed back by heavy Confederate fire, and so the 9th Kansas Cavalry were ordered to charge under the covering fire of the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry. With the cavalry having gained a bridgehead across the creek, Williams led the men of his own regiment, the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, in a headlong charge across the stream and into the brush. This forced the Confederates back and Williams pursued them for a quarter of a mile as they attempted to rally in a clearing. Williams then led his convoy to successfully resupply Fort Gibson. Confederate casualties amounted to 65 men killed, with the Union Army suffering between 3 and 23 dead with 30 wounded. The action made possible the continuation of a Union force in the Indian Territory, allowing the later victories at Honey Springs and Fort Smith. Soon after the battle, the Union established defensive outposts along the Texas Road, including one at the Cabin Creek crossing. The battle has the distinction of being the first in which African American soldiers fought alongside white troops. A monument to the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry was erected on the battlefield on 7 July 2007. Second Battle of Cabin Creek. The Second Battle of Cabin Creek was part of a plan conceived by Confederate Brigadier General Stand Waisher. The plan was to have a Confederate force attack central Kansas from Indian Territory, raiding Union Army facilities and encouraging Indian tribes in western Kansas to join in an attack on the eastern part of the state. Waisher presented the plan to his superior, General S.B. Maxey, on February 5, 1864. Maxey approved the plan on the condition that the attack would start by October 1, to coincide with an attack on Missouri already planned by General Sterling Price. Preparation. Brigadier General Richard Montgomery Garneau and Waite met at Camp Pike in the Choctaw Nation on 13 September 1864, to make plans for the coming expedition. Garneau, commanding several Texas Confederate units, had agreed to join Waisher as co-leader of the campaign. Waisher, however, knew that most of the Texans hated all the Indians, including their allies, and resented his promotion in the Confederate Army. According to one account, Colonel Charles de Morse of the 29th Texas Cavalry Regiment refused to serve under him. Waisher, therefore, deferred to Garneau as commander of the expedition. Both Garneau and Maxey commended Waite for this act of solidarity. Moreover, Garneau had more seniority as a Confederate general than did Waisher. Waisher would continue to command the Indian Brigade, composed of about 800 men. Garneau's brigade comprised Texas cavalry and artillery units containing about 1,200 men. The raid had targeted a wagon train that left Fort Scott on 12 September. It carried supplies and provisions intended for Native Americans who had fled their homes and camped near Fort Gibson. It was led by Major Henry Hopkins. The train was escorted by 80 soldiers of the 2nd Kansas Cavalry, 50 men from the 6th Kansas Cavalry and 130 men of the 14th Kansas Cavalry. A group of 100 pro-Union Cherokees joined the train at Baxter Springs, Kansas, but half were left at the Neosho River Junction to guard the rear. The escort was to be increased by 170 Union Cherokees of the 2nd Indian Regiment, based at Cabin Creek, and 140 Cherokees of the 3rd Indian Regiment en route from Fort Gibson. Major Hopkins received a message to move the train to Cabin Creek as fast as possible and await further orders. The message also said that Major John A. Foreman, 6 companies of men and 2 howitzers were en route as a relief force. The train arrived at Cabin Creek Station during the afternoon of September 18. Flat Rock attack on 16 September. As they were waiting for the supply train, the Confederates happened to encounter a detachment of black Union soldiers conducting haymaking operations at Flat Rock, near the confluence of Flat Rock Creek and the Grand River, about 5 miles northeast of present-day Wagner, Oklahoma and 15 miles northwest of Fort Gibson. Captain E. A. Barker, leading a small group of the 2nd Kansas Cavalry and a detachment from the 1st Kansas Colored Infantry, who were guarding the operation, were soon surrounded and attacked from all sides. In desperation, Barker ordered his men with horses to attempt to break out. Only 15 of the 65 men who attempted to break out reached the fort. The Union troops lost all their haymaking equipment, several hundred tons of hay and over 100 casualties. There were unconfirmed reports that many of the black troops were killed by the Texans. These killings led to one historians calling the action one of Waite's 3 most infamous actions of the war. Confederate attack. The Second Battle of Cabin Creek began at 1 a.m. on September 19. The Confederates advanced with the Texans covering the left flank and the Indian Brigade on the right flank. After the Union troops began to fire, the Confederate artillery answered. The barrage caused the mules to panic and run. Many dragged their wagons with them. Some were so terrified that they fell off the bluff and into Cabin Creek. The teamsters managed to cut many of the mules from their traces. The men jumped on the mules and rode across the ford to safer ground. Sunrise revealed the Union positions. Garneau moved part of his artillery to his right flank, so that the wagon train would be caught in crossfire. The two Cherokee regiments moved across the creek to capture the wagons that had escaped in the darkness. The Texans, led by Garneau himself, attacked the Union flank, driving it back until the defenders were scattered in the wooded bottoms along the creek. By 9 a.m., the Union forces had been routed. Major Hopkins escaped to Fort Gibson, hoping to meet the Major Foreman's relief force and recapture the train. Failing to find the relief force, he continued to Fort Gibson bearing the news of the disaster. Out come the Confederate force, led by Weisher, and Brigadier General Richard Montgomery. Garneau captured a Federal wagon train, about $1 million worth of wagons, mules, commissary supplies, and other needed items. Specifically, the booty included 740 mules and 130 wagons. Although Weisher and his troops were commended for their success by Confederate President Jefferson Davis and the Confederate Congress, this battle had no significant impact on the outcome of the Civil War in Indian Territory. Preserving the battlefield, a young Cherokee named Joseph Martin acquired land on Cabin Creek in 1840. This would become his headquarters for a ranch named Pensacola that he developed over the next 20 years, containing over 100,000 acres. By 1860, he had also developed a station on his property along the Texas Road, where travelers to Texas could buy provisions and have their wagons repaired. A part of this land would become the Cabin Creek battleground. There was little interest in preserving the site of these two battles until 1958. That was when the Veneta chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy decided to buy a 10-acre plot of ground that now considered the core of the battlefield. The group approached the landowner about the proposed purchase and agreed on a price of $300. The UDC chapter spent the next 3 years raising funds and finalized the purchase in 1961. They donated the land to the Oklahoma Historical Society later in the same year. The same UDC chapter donated a monument to the Confederate victory of 1864 to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the event. The O's created a circle drive within the park and added some small monuments that commemorated the battle positions of the two forces. Interest in the park waned for a number of years and maintenance was neglected. Many monuments were vandalized. In 1992, the O's and the Grand Lake Chamber of Commerce jointly sponsored a reenactment of the battles. It was considered a success, drawing about 15,000 visitors, with reenactors coming from many parts of the United States. Encouraged by the public response, the O's proposed to repeat the event every 3 years. A non-profit organization named the Friends of Cabin Creek Battlefield, Inc. was formed to clean up the park, repair the damaged monuments, and add trash cans and park benches. A day-use-only policy was put into effect, with the park gates unlocked in the morning and locked in the evenings 365 days a year. The Civil War Trust bought an additional 90 acres in 2011, so that the park now covers most of the original battlefield of the First Battle of Cabin Creek. As of September 2013, the trust had begun a fundraising campaign to repay its investment.